New Orleans, Louisiana, April 1842. The air over the French Quarter hangs thick as velvet, clinging to skin and stone alike. Gas lamps flicker against wrought-iron balconies, carriages rattle over wet cobblestones, and behind shuttered windows the city's elite sip imported wine and pretend their hands are clean. On this particular night, a strange disturbance ripples through their carefully polished world. A young enslaved girl steps into the heart of their society wearing diamonds, real diamonds, that should not exist. Jewels so brilliant they catch every flame and throw it back like shards of captured stars. A necklace worth more than plantations, earrings that once belonged to a woman said to be buried 20 years ago. And yet here they are, glittering on the neck of someone who should never have had access to such wealth. Within 2 weeks of her appearance, the host of that prestigious salon will be found dead under suspiciously natural circumstances. Within a month, 5 of New Orleans' richest families will be locked in a silent and vicious war, trading bribes, threats, and secrets behind silk curtains. And within 3 months, the girl herself will simply vanish, leaving behind only the diamonds arranged on a table, laid out like a message written in light and stone, a message that would haunt the city for decades. Who was she, this girl who dared to enter their world uninvited? Where did she find jewels that were supposed to be locked in a coffin that never existed? And what secret was so explosive that powerful men would risk prison, ruin, and murder to keep it buried? Tonight on Noctivox Dark Stories, we're not just talking about a mysterious girl or stolen diamonds. We're unearthing a buried crime that began in the swamps 20 years earlier, tangled in the shadows of an illegal slave trade New Orleans pretended it had abandoned. This city, famous for its music, masquerades, and glittering parties, was also a machine built on stolen labor, hidden violence, and officials who knew when not to ask questions. A woman once tried to expose the truth behind that machine, and she was killed for it. But a 10-year-old enslaved girl saw everything, escaped with the diamonds ripped from the murdered woman's body, and waited 2 decades to return. Tonight, we tell her story, the truth that was never meant to reach daylight. If you're new to the channel, welcome to Noctivox Dark Stories. This is where we investigate the histories powerful people wanted erased, the buried crimes, the forgotten victims, the testimonies that survived only because someone refused to stay silent. Before we descend deeper into the gaslit streets of 1840s New Orleans, go ahead and hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. We are building a community that refuses to look away when history turns dark. Because those diamonds weren't just jewelry. They were evidence. They were truth forged into stone. And when that girl stepped into the brightest room in New Orleans, she brought the darkness with her and exposed crimes the city had spent 20 years burying. To understand the mystery of the girl who wore diamonds, we first have to understand the world she walked into. New Orleans in 1842 was at the height of what people later called its golden age, a city bursting with money, arrogance, and contradictions. The port was the lifeblood of the region, swallowing ships from Cuba, New York, France, and West Africa, and spitting out fortunes overnight. Cotton and sugar moved through its warehouses like rivers of white wealth, filling bank accounts while enslaved hands did the labor that no one in polite society dared to acknowledge. The French Quarter buzzed with languages, French, English, Spanish, Creole, its balconies dripping with ironwork and secrets. And beneath the music, perfumes, and expensive fabrics was a rigid social hierarchy as sharp and unforgiving as a blade. At the very top of that hierarchy sat the old Creole families, descendants of French and Spanish colonists, who guarded their lineage like treasure. They believed themselves to be the true aristocracy of Louisiana, superior to newcomers with fresh money and rougher manners. And no family carried more influence in this world than the Beaumonts. Alexandra Beaumont, 62, had spent a lifetime shaping New Orleans society through strategic marriages, ruthless business alliances, and an elegance that hid a cold, calculating nature. His daughter Isabel was the city's social general, hosting weekly salons that decided careers, reputations, and fortunes. If she approved of you, you rose. If she excluded you, you were finished. Their mansion on Esplanade Avenue was more than a home. It was a throne room. Just beneath these Creole dynasties were the American merchants, outsiders who arrived with ambition, capital, and a hunger to claim a piece of New Orleans' wealth. The Morrison family was the perfect example. Thomas Morrison had come from Philadelphia 15 years earlier and bought his way into respectability by marrying Celeste, a Beaumont cousin. His cotton factoring business processed crops from dozens of plantations, taking a percentage of every transaction. Polite society pretended not to notice that his profits came from the same enslaved labor they publicly claimed to disdain. His son, Robert, well-dressed and well-educated, was being groomed to take over the business and perhaps step into politics. Robert moved through salons with ease, unaware that his comfortable life rested on a buried crime committed before he was born. But power in New Orleans didn't belong only to the wealthy planters and merchants. A third tier, the professional class, held influence through discretion, connections, and secrets whispered in locked rooms. Dr. Henri Duclos, physician to the Creole families, knew every fragile vein and every scandal tucked behind lace curtains. Antoine Deveau, an attorney whose quiet competence made him the man families turned to when their problems needed to disappear from public record. And Jacques Mercier, jeweler to the elite, whose royal street shop held gems worth more than ships, land, or even entire plantations. These three men, doctor, lawyer, jeweler, operated like the gears of a hidden machine, ensuring that the wealthy stayed untouchable. On paper, they served the elite. In truth, they protected them. Together, the Beaumonts, the Morrisons, and this professional triumvirate formed the invisible skeleton of New Orleans' power structure in 1842. They cooperated when it benefited them, clashed when it didn't, and shared only one common vow: to keep the social order intact. This order depended on wealth, reputation, and silence, especially silence about an incident that had occurred 20 years earlier. The older people in the city remembered it, but no one spoke of it openly: a disappearance, a supposed death during a yellow fever outbreak, and a jewelry collection that vanished with the woman who owned it. The woman was Marguerite Beaumont, Alexandra's wife, Isabel's mother. And while the official story claimed she died and was buried with her jewels, rumors said otherwise. Rumors whispered of something darker, something violent, something that involved the very men now shaping society. For 2 decades, the city had successfully buried that scandal. No newspapers printed it, no officials investigated it, no family dared mention it within earshot of the Beaumont name. But in 1842, as the French Quarter buzzed with prosperity, someone began to stir the ashes of that forgotten fire. Sightings emerged of a young enslaved girl wearing jewels that matched descriptions of Marguerite's lost collection, diamonds that were said to have vanished forever. Diamonds that no slave should possess, no matter how bold or foolish. The whispers spread through salons and marketplaces, and every influential household felt the chill of a secret returning from the grave. The first whispers began softly, the kind of rumor people repeat with a laugh, then repeat again with a lowered voice when they realize no one is laughing. A slave girl, young, maybe 18 or 19, had been seen in the French Quarter wearing diamonds. Not beads, not colored glass, not cheap river stones dressed up as jewels, but real diamonds cut so clean they burned like fire when the light hit them. People swore they saw them. Some said the earrings alone were worth more than a house on Dauphine Street. Others claimed the necklace looked like something ripped straight from a royal portrait. It sounded impossible. And yet the sightings continued. She wasn't just noticeable because of the jewels. Witnesses described her as striking in a way they struggled to put into words. Skin like warm amber catching the evening lantern glow, hair falling in dark waves past her shoulders, and eyes, those eyes, that shifted between gold and brown depending on the light, a detail repeated by unrelated witnesses, which meant it wasn't embellishment, it was truth. Her features suggested mixed heritage, the kind New Orleans recognized instantly: Creole, African, European, woven into one face. But beauty wasn't what unsettled people. It was the calm, almost regal way she carried herself, like someone who knew she wasn't supposed to exist, yet existed anyway. By day, she blended into the background of the city, wearing the plain cotton dresses assigned to enslaved women, head down, quiet, invisible by design. But at night, she transformed. She drifted through markets, along river walks, and past saloons in gowns too fine for a servant and diamonds that stopped conversations mid-sentence. People claimed the contrast was uncanny, like watching two different lives stitched to the same body. A girl who lived in daylight poverty and nighttime splendor. Someone even said, she walks the day like she owes the world nothing, and the night like the world owes her an explanation. The contradictions only fed the mystery. Whispers eventually slipped into the city's most sacred space for gossip, Isabelle Beaumont's Tuesday Salon, a weekly gathering where New Orleans elite came to trade influence under the disguise of polite conversation. On that evening, the parlor glowed with candlelight, silk dresses swayed, wine glasses clinked softly, and behind every smile hid someone waiting for a delicious scandal. It was Celeste Morrison who finally said it aloud, leaning in with a tone that pretended to be casual but wasn't. Isabelle, have you heard about the slave girl? The one wearing diamonds that cannot possibly be real. Yet everyone swears they are. The room paused, subtly, but unmistakably. Isabelle lifted her chin, interest sharpening behind her composed expression. Whose slave is she? She asked, because that question mattered more than the jewels. A slave with priceless diamonds implied a master with a dangerous secret. But Celeste shook her head. That's the strange part. No one claims her. The stories contradict each other, and yet everyone who has seen her agrees she wears jewels no one could ignore. Jacques Mercier, the jeweler, had been listening quietly. But when diamonds entered the conversation, his restraint slipped. Setting his glass down harder than intended, he muttered, "One of my apprentices insists he saw her wearing earrings identical to a pair I crafted 20 years ago." The room shifted, the way a room does when someone steps too close to a locked door. Isabelle's expression sharpened. "For whom?" she asked, her voice delicate but edged with command. Mercier hesitated, eyes darting toward Alexandra Beaumont, seated near the fireplace. Alexandra's normally polished calm wavered just enough for those watching to sense it. Mercier swallowed hard. "For a client whose affairs I am not at liberty to discuss," he said, which was not an answer, and therefore revealed everything. Because 20 years ago, the Beaumont mansion had nearly collapsed under the weight of a scandal no one dared to mention anymore. A scandal involving Alexandra's wife, Margaret. Her sudden death during a yellow fever outbreak no doctor documented. And a jewelry collection, known as the Thornwood Diamonds, that vanished the very same night. The official story said the jewels had been buried with her, but the few who'd ever seen them recognized their uniqueness. Now someone in this room was suggesting those same stones were glittering around the neck of a slave girl in the French Quarter. As the salon tried to move on, Alexandra pulled Isabelle aside, his voice low, trembling beneath decades of composure. "If those are Margaret's diamonds, then someone knows what happened." He looked older in that moment, eyes hollow with a fear his daughter had never seen before. "Someone has waited 20 years to show them. Someone wants us to see them. Isabelle, our secrets aren't as buried as we believed." And that was the moment the whispers became something else. Not a rumor, not a curiosity, but a threat rising from the grave. A ghost wearing diamonds, walking the streets of New Orleans, ready to unravel a crime the city had spent 20 years trying to forget. Robert Morrison first saw her on an April evening near Jackson Square. The sun was dissolving into the river, leaving the city washed in gold and shadow. Children played near the iron fence, vendors closed their stalls, and the cathedral bells murmured in the distance. And there she was, sitting alone on a bench as if she had been waiting for him specifically. The diamonds around her neck flickered with the last light of day, glowing like embers that refused to die. Robert froze, breath caught in his throat because she looked impossibly out of place and yet entirely at ease, as though New Orleans itself had parted to make room for her. He approached her slowly, rehearsing the polite, disarming tone he used in business. But before he could speak, she turned her head and said softly, "Good evening, Mr. Morrison." His blood ran cold. He had never met her, never spoken her name aloud, yet she knew exactly who he was. "You've been looking for me for 4 days," she continued, "paying informants, walking the quarter as if you understand its shadows." Robert swallowed hard, struggling to mask his shock. "You know who I am. But do you know why I'm searching?" he asked. She smiled, not kindly but knowingly. "You're searching because the diamonds frighten you. Because you sense what they mean." Robert tried to regain control of the conversation. A slave girl wearing jewels worth more than plantations will raise questions. Any man would investigate that. But she tilted her head, eyes glinting with an unsettling mixture of pity and challenge. "You ask about the jewelry to avoid asking what truly matters," she said. "Your family's wealth comes from cotton factored through stolen labor. You know this, but you choose not to look too closely. Comfort makes cowards of most men." Her words cut deeper than he expected, because they were true. He'd heard abolitionist rhetoric before, dismissed it easily. But hearing these accusations from a girl wearing impossible diamonds made them impossible to ignore. He attempted to shift the conversation. "Who are you?" he asked, voice lowered. She rose from the bench with a grace that felt practiced, almost ceremonial. "Someone who remembers," she said. "Someone who knows the debts your fathers tried to bury. Some debts don't expire, Mr. Morrison. Some crimes don't stay hidden in the swamp just because powerful men want them to." Before he could respond, she stepped into a narrow corridor between two buildings. Robert followed instantly, but when he reached the passage, she was gone, vanished as though she'd slipped between worlds. All that remained was the echo of her words rattling in his mind. Rattled, Robert returned home to find his father waiting for him, not alone, but with Dr. Duclos and Antoine Deveau seated tensely around a half-emptied bottle of brandy. The room felt suffocating, thick with fear rather than smoke. Thomas looked at his son with hollow eyes. "We have a problem," he said, wasting no time on pleasantries. "A problem that started 20 years ago and has found its way back to us." Robert sank into a chair, the girl's voice still echoing in his skull. "She told me she knows about crimes, debts, something buried in the swamp," he said slowly. The older men exchanged glances, exhausted, frightened glances. Finally, Dr. Duclos exhaled and spoke. 20 years ago, in 1822, Alexandra Beaumont's wife, Marguerite, learned something she should not have known. Something dangerous." He paused, as though saying it aloud could summon the dead. "She discovered that several families, including ours, were involved in illegal slave shipments, even after the federal ban. She threatened to expose the operation, send letters to authorities, bring everything crashing down." Robert felt the floor tilt beneath him. "So you stopped her?" he whispered. The room went silent, which was answer enough. Thomas took over, voice trembling. "She refused to be silenced. She'd written letters, prepared testimony. If that information reached Washington, we would have lost everything. Our businesses, our names, our futures." His hands shook as he poured another drink. A choice had to be made. Robert stared at him in horror, a horror that deepened with each passing second. "You murdered her," he said. Not a question, but a verdict. None of the three men denied it. Not even in words, Deveau added quietly. "It was meant to look like fever." Dr. Duclos filed the report. Mercier, yes, the jeweler, handled the jewels, the Thornwood diamonds. He was to smuggle them out of the city so nothing could trace back to us. But as he spoke, a shadow crossed his face. Not all of them disappeared. Or perhaps someone intervened. Robert remembered the girl's golden brown eyes in the dying light, the diamonds glowing at her throat. "The diamonds were supposed to vanish with Marguerite," he murmured. Thomas nodded, pale as parchment. "We took her body into the swamp, weighted it, disposed of the evidence, but someone else was there, someone we didn't see." Dr. Duclos finished the thought with a shaking voice. "Those diamonds she wears, they are proof she witnessed everything. And in that dim room, the weight of a 20-year-old crime finally cracked open. The swamp had given up its memory and wrapped it around the neck of a girl the city could no longer ignore. The night of Isabelle Beaumont's salon felt wrong from the beginning. The chandeliers burned a little too bright. The air felt a little too tight in the lungs. Guests arrived in their finest clothes, but their smiles were strained, their laughter a little too loud and quick to fade. Word had spread about the slave girl with diamonds, and everyone knew on some level that if she truly existed, tonight would be the night she appeared. Alexandra stood near the fireplace with a glass he barely touched. Thomas Morrison lingered close to him, eyes on the door more than on any conversation. Dr. Duclos and Antoine Deveau positioned themselves near exits, as if already measuring the fastest way out. Isabelle, in a gown of pale silk, played her usual part as queen of the room. She greeted every guest, asked the right questions, laughed at the appropriate moments, but even she could feel it. The way conversations drifted back to rumors, the way people kept glancing toward the entrance. The Beaumont mansion had always been a stage for power, but tonight it felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. The musicians played, the servants moved through the crowd with trays of wine, and beneath it all, a shared anxiety crackled like static in the air. Everyone knew something was coming, no one knew quite what shape it would take. It arrived at 8:30. The footman at the door hesitated long enough that half the room turned to look. Framed in the doorway stood the girl, but not in cotton. She wore a gown of deep blue silk that clung and flowed with every breath she took. And the diamonds, every single one of Margaret Beaumont's pieces. The necklace burned at her throat. Earrings swung like falling stars every time she moved. Bracelets flashed at her wrists. A brooch pinned at her breast. And a tiara, an actual tiara, rested on her hair where no enslaved woman had any right to wear such a thing. The room fell silent in an instant. Conversations cut off mid-word. Fans froze halfway through their fluttering patterns. Even the musicians faltered. 40 of New Orleans' most powerful people stood and stared at a young enslaved girl, dressed like royalty, wearing jewels that should have been buried 2 decades ago. She did not look down, did not shrink. She walked into the center of the room as if she had been born to it, as if this salon, this crowd, this chandeliered space were all merely a stage she had chosen for her performance. "Good evening," she said, her voice clear, carrying easily through the stunned quiet. "Thank you for receiving me, Mademoiselle Beaumont." Her accent was perfectly French, her tone perfectly controlled. "I know my invitation was unconventional, but I have a story to share. One I believe concerns everyone present." Isabel's face went from pale to flushed to pale again. "You have no invitation," she snapped. "You are trespassing. Someone call the authorities at once." The girl turned her head slightly, and the diamonds laughed in the candlelight. "By all means," she replied calmly. "Summon them. I'm sure the newspapers will be fascinated by the arrest of a slave girl wearing the jewels that were supposedly buried with Marguerite Beaumont 20 years ago. That name hit the room like a dropped chandelier. A few guests gasped outright. Others looked instantly to Alexandra, whose grip on his glass tightened until it seemed it might shatter. "These jewels belong to Marguerite Beaumont," the girl continued. "I know this because I was there the night she received them as a wedding gift. I was 10 years old, enslaved in this house, assigned to attend her in her private chambers." She raised a hand, touching the necklace lightly. "I fastened this clasp for her. I watched her put on the left earring first, always the left. I saw the small scar on her collarbone, right here, where broken glass cut her as a child." Each detail landed with the heavy, undeniable weight of memory. Alexandra tried to speak, but his voice shook. "This is madness," he managed. "A fantasy from a girl looking for attention." The girl, Lette, though she had not yet spoken her name, met his gaze without flinching. "If this is fantasy, then why does your face look like a man seeing a ghost?" she asked softly. "My name is Lette. I was the child who slept in the small room off Marguerite's bedchamber. I woke on the night she died to the sound of men arguing. I saw you, Alexandra. I saw you, Thomas. I saw you, Dr. Duclos. I saw you, Monsieur Deveau. And I saw Jacques Mercier, who stripped the jewels from her as she lay dying." The salon seemed to shrink around her words. The crowd pressed in, drawn by horror and fascination. Lette's voice did not tremble as she laid the night out piece by piece. It was May 16th, 1822, she said. Margaret had spent the day writing letters. She planned to expose the illegal slave ships that made your fortunes. She told you she had sent them. You told her that if she spoke, you would all fall. You gave her a choice, poison or force. Her eyes flicked to Dr. Duclos. You brought the poison, Doctor. She drank it herself rather than let you hold her down. I watched her die. Lette continued. Her body convulsed, her breath rattled, and you, respectable men of New Orleans, stood around her bed and waited for the poison to finish. When it was done, you took these diamonds from her body. You wrapped her in canvas, carried her to a carriage, and you drove into the swamp. The room was so silent, the crackle of the fire sounded like thunder. I hid in the back of that carriage. I heard you decide the story you would tell. Yellow fever, a tragic loss, jewels buried with her as a pious gesture. Her gaze moved from man to man, pinning each in place. In the swamp you threw her body into the water, Lette said. You weighed it down with chains so it would never surface. You tossed the jewelry box in after her, but you didn't notice when I jumped. I dove into the dark water. My hands closed around the box before it sank. And while you congratulated yourselves on erasing her, I slipped away through the reeds with the only proof I could carry. Her voice hardened. For 20 years, I have kept these diamonds, learned your names, your businesses, your weaknesses, and tonight I have brought them back to the house where they were first worn, not as ornaments, but as accusations. Isabel stepped forward, eyes bright with fury and something like heartbreak. You expect us to believe this? She demanded, that my father murdered my mother, that all of this is built on lies. Lette turned to her, and for the first time her expression softened slightly. You were 12 when she died, she said. Old enough to remember that no one else had yellow fever that season. Old enough to notice that the doctor's report appeared faster than any priest. Did you never wonder why your mother vanished in a single night? Isabel's voice cracked. He told me she died peacefully, quickly, that she didn't suffer. Lette shook her head. He lied, she said quietly. She suffered. And she died knowing her husband chose money over her life. The room could not hold together after that. The perfect order of Isabel's salon shattered. Some guests fled for the door, desperate to avoid being associated with what they had heard. Others stood rooted to the spot, faces pale, forced to watch the unraveling of the world they thought they understood. Servants hovered at the edges, uncertain whether to call the authorities or disappear before anyone remembered they existed. Isabel turned on Alexandra, voice rising into a raw scream. Is it true? Did you kill her? And Alexandra, who had spent 20 years mastering every expression, could not summon a single lie. His silence answered for him. And in that silence, the entire structure of New Orleans high society began to crack, as a slave girl in blue silk and dead woman's diamonds stood at its center and held up the truth for everyone to see. The morning of the courthouse hearing arrived with a sky the color of pewter. Lette dressed not in silk this time, but in a simple, dignified gown, still blue but unadorned, because today was not performance. Today was justice. She knew very well that men who had murdered once to protect their fortunes would not hesitate to do so again. Every step she took toward the courthouse felt like walking through echoes of the swamp where Margaret Beaumont had died. She tightened her grip on the small leather portfolio containing the letters, maps, and accounts she had gathered over 2 decades, proof no one could bury this time. She expected to die before noon, but she intended to die telling the truth if that was the price. She did not even make it to Chartres Street before the first attempt came. In Exchange Alley, normally crowded with fishmongers and newspaper boys, the foot traffic mysteriously thinned. Lette knew the pattern. Too quiet, too clean, too intentional. 3 men stepped out from behind crates, not plantation hands, not thieves, hired knives. Their hands hovered near coat pockets, where the outlines of blades and pistols hid beneath cloth. Lette breathed once, deeply, preparing for the strike she couldn't possibly survive. But before the men could close in, voices rose behind her, sharp, firm, unmistakable. A small crowd emerged from both ends of the alley. Free black dock workers, women from the market, a Creole merchant who owed Margaret Beaumont a silent debt. People who had seen Lette walking the quarter for years, who knew strength when they saw it. They formed a barrier around her, forcing the hired attackers to retreat. One of the dock workers leaned close and murmured, "You're not walking alone today, Miss Lette? Not anymore." She nodded, throat tight, and let them escort her forward. The attempt had failed, but she knew others were coming. The courthouse steps were already overflowing before she arrived. White merchants and planters stood shoulder to shoulder with free men of color, abolitionists from the north, dock workers curious for spectacle, and society women whose carriages lined the street like gaudy feathers. Federal marshals kept a tense perimeter, their stiff posture revealing they sensed how dangerous this gathering could become. Lette walked up the steps flanked by her allies, conscious of every eye fixed on her. Some glared, some whispered her name like a prayer, and some, mostly the young, looked at her the way one looks at a crack opening in a wall that had never been meant to crack. Just as the marshals moved to open the courthouse doors, a cry rose from the crowd. The sea of bodies parted, and Alexandra Beaumont stepped forward. No carriage, no entourage, no polished mask. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years overnight. His hands shook as he approached Lette, and he fell to his knees before her, stunning the entire square. "Please," he whispered, voice breaking. "Lette, do not go inside. If you testify, everything collapses. Our family, our legacy, everything." His desperation spilled out in ragged breaths. "I will confess, I will take the blame, every bit of it. Just spare the rest. Spare Isabel." Lette regarded him with a calm that silenced even the marshals. "You want to confess now because the truth has already escaped you," she said. "But confession without consequences is just another lie." Alexandra bowed his head, trembling. "Tell me what you want," he whispered. Lette stepped closer, her voice low but carrying across the crowd. "I want the record," she said. "A full confession taken in public, sworn under federal authority, not whispered in a salon, not scribbled in a private letter. I want the truth carved into the law so it cannot be rewritten." He swallowed hard, nodding slowly, but Lette continued, "Second, every man involved will make restitution. Funds for the freedom of every surviving person trafficked through your 1822 operation, education for their children, legal aid for those still enslaved. You built fortunes on their suffering. You will tear those fortunes apart to repair even a fraction of the damage." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Shock, disbelief, dawning support. Alexandra's eyes flicked toward Thomas and the others, who stood pale as marble behind the marshals. "And third," Lette said, lifting the leather portfolio in her hands, "these diamonds will enter evidence, not as trophies but as testimony, and with them, the documents I have gathered, shipping manifests, account books, Marguerite's letters, and my own account from that night. The world will know what you did, and what you tried to bury." A federal marshal stepped forward, voice booming across the square. "Alexandra Beaumont, Thomas Morrison, Dr. Henri Duclos, Antoine Deveau, you are hereby placed under federal arrest pending charges of conspiracy, murder, and participation in illegal slave trafficking." Gasps tore through the crowd. Isabel Beaumont covered her mouth, sobbing not from disbelief but from the confirmation of truths she had feared since the night of the salon. Alexandra slowly rose, shoulders collapsing inward, and lifted his wrists for the irons. Lette stepped aside as the marshals moved past her. Her allies tightened their formation, guarding her now not from ambush, but from the crush of history shifting beneath their feet. The courthouse doors opened with a groan that sounded almost ceremonial, and for the first time in 20 years, New Orleans watched justice begin to move. Slow, imperfect, dangerous, but real. The trials unfolded like a slow-burning storm. Not dramatic at first, but relentless, gathering weight with every witness, every document, every gasp from the packed courtroom. Alexandra Beaumont sat rigid as Lette's testimony opened the proceedings. Calm, precise, devastating. She described the poison, the carriage, the swamp, and as she spoke, the diamonds glittered under the courthouse lamps, displayed as physical evidence of a crime no one could deny anymore. Margaret's letters were read aloud, her handwriting trembling across the page, detailing threats she had received and the names of the men she feared. Financial records emerged next, shipping manifests, coded ledgers, bribes, each line tearing another layer from the facade of respectability the city's elite had worn for decades. When the verdicts came, they landed like stones dropped into deep water. Alexandra Beaumont, guilty of murder, conspiracy, and participation in an illegal slave trade. Thomas Morrison, guilty on all counts related to trafficking and cover-up. Dr. Duclos, guilty for falsifying death records and providing poison. Antoine Deveau, guilty of obstruction, perjury, and facilitating the disposal of Marguerite's body. Only Jacques Mercier was missing, having fled the city the night before his summons, leaving behind an empty shop and a shattered reputation. Sentences varied. Alexandra received the harshest, life in federal custody, stripped of title and property. Thomas followed him into a long sentence. The wealth he once flaunted now seized to fund reparations. Duclos and Deveau faced years in prison, their names etched forever into the public record as men who traded humanity for profit. The courtroom erupted each time a sentence was read, not violently, but with the quiet thunder of history shifting, of a society realizing that its untouchables were not untouchable anymore. But justice, even here, was imperfect. Slavery itself did not fall because of this trial. Plantations still operated, ships still docked, fortunes still flowed. New Orleans remained a city built on the backs of the oppressed. Yet something had cracked open, something sharp and irreversible. The myth of invincible aristocracy died in that courtroom, and in its place, a new question flickered across the city. If these men could fall, who else might one day answer for their sins? Robert Morrison and Isabel Beaumont emerged from the wreckage of their families carrying a burden they hadn't chosen but could not escape. With Lette's guidance, sometimes stern, sometimes weary, they created a foundation funded by the seized Morrison and Beaumont estates. Its purpose was direct and radical: to purchase the freedom of enslaved people, to support the education of free black children, and to provide legal assistance for those fighting for their families. It was not redemption, not truly, but it was a beginning, a crack of light forced through generations of darkness. Lette herself became more than a witness. She became a counselor within the free black community, a strategist, a symbol of what truth could accomplish even when the world insisted it had no place in courtrooms. She refused fame, refused wealth, refused to let her story become spectacle. Instead, she moved quietly between homes, churches, and meeting halls, offering guidance to those who needed it. Her presence a reminder that survival could become transformation. The diamonds, Margaret's diamonds, never returned to adorn a neck again. They remained locked in federal custody, officially labeled evidence. But for the people of New Orleans, they became something else entirely. Not ornaments, not wealth, but shards of truth, glittering proof that even the most powerful lies can fracture under the weight of one girl's courage. Lette did not remain in New Orleans after the trials. The city that had once tried to swallow her now felt too small, too heavy with memories and ghosts. With quiet support from abolitionist networks, she traveled north and eventually settled in Boston. There, she lived a life far removed from the swamp water, salons, and silenced cries of her childhood. She worked as a teacher, a translator, and sometimes as a quiet advisor to anti-slavery organizers. And when the news finally came, slavery abolished across the United States, she stood in a small New England church and let herself weep, not because justice had fully arrived, but because a door had opened that she once believed would remain sealed forever. She did not keep Marguerite's diamonds. The federal government held them for years, but when the evidence was no longer needed, Lette petitioned for their release, not to wear them but to transform them. The jewels were sold, and every coin went into the construction of a school for black girls in Boston, a place where knowledge became inheritance instead of chains. The school still exists today in archival traces, renamed, rebuilt, but still carrying the legacy of the woman who turned trauma into a foundation. And so the legend of the slave girl who wore diamonds traveled far beyond New Orleans, whispered in kitchens, taught in activist circles, retold as folktale and warning. Power can bury bodies, but not always the truth they carry. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable realities. Wealth, especially wealth that seems too polished, too perfect, often hides the bones of what built it. Justice, when it finally arrives, rarely sweeps the slate clean. It limps, it compromises, it reaches only so far. But truth, once spoken aloud, once dragged into the light, becomes very hard to silence. Lette's courage did not topple a system, but it cracked it. And those cracks widened into the fractures that would one day break it open. She proved that one witness, even one child who survived a night meant to erase her, could one day force the powerful to kneel. So now I want to ask you, what other buried stories should we uncover on this channel? Which forgotten voices deserve to be heard again? And do you believe that history can ever deliver real justice, or only imperfect echoes of it? If you're new to Noctivox Dark Stories, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who loves uncovering the darkness beneath the polite surface of history. We explore the truths people tried to hide, the crimes they hoped would stay buried, and the legends born from those who refused to be silent. Until next time, keep your eyes open, because the past is never as dead as people want it to be.